Good morning. Good morning. This is Jamaica Live. We're on Bridge 99. We broadcast here from Kingston. So good morning to all the Jamaican listeners. And then, of course, at midday, we link with Irie Jam in New York so that we'll be able to hail up the Jamaicans there, the diaspora. It's Monday the 20th of June. This is a discussion program, a single issue discussion program. Each week we identify a particular topic and we try to delve as deeply into it as we can. We try to select topics that we feel are important to us as a people, as a country, and then we try to go into it in as much detail as possible. We invite as our guests people who have expertise, people who we feel can bring value to the discussions. All, of course, in the hope that it will allow listeners to get a better understanding of these issues, to help them to form their own opinions, and to be better informed, to have a better understanding of the things that affect you. So that is what we're all about. It's Jamaica Live. We're on Bridge 99. You know, people go to the supermarkets and grocery shops every week. Some have to go every day because they can only afford to buy a little at a time. Most of us have to stretch the money to buy the things that we need. When you find that the $2,000 or $3,000 that you have can't buy what it was able to buy 2 or 3 weeks ago, you have a problem. You must either fork out more money, if you have it, or you have to put back some of what you had in the shopping cart. There are some things that you can't put back, like the baby feed. Sometimes instead of the 2 pounds of flour, you have to settle for 1 pound and know that you will have to stretch it. The cookies that the children love, they may have to do without it. It is what is called inflation, or as people call it, the price raise up. It hits the raw nerve of the quality of life, especially for those who could hardly afford a trip to the supermarket or grocery shop in the first place. Now, for about 5 years before COVID hit us, prices were relatively stable. You go to buy something today and the price is the same as what you bought it for last month or the month before. The $2,000 or $3,000 that you have could do the trick week after week. When COVID came, prices started to move up. Sickness and lockdowns caused disruption in the production and distribution of basic commodities, things like wheat, rice. And this affected the supply and the availability of these things. I remember seeing pictures on the television of ships loaded with containers, piled up at ports all over the world. They couldn't let off their cargo because the ports were affected by COVID. Plenty of people sick, plenty of people have to stay home, plenty of people have symptoms and therefore they have to quarantine. When supplies go down, prices go up. It's the law of economics that is as rigid as the law of nature. And then just as COVID started to ease off, Russia decided to invade Ukraine. What does this have to do with prices? a whole heap. Russia and Ukraine account for almost 1/3 of the world's supply of grain. That is wheat and corn and sorghum. And that translates into flour, bread, animal feeds, and a host of other things that we buy at the supermarkets and grocery shops. Russia is the world's second largest producer of natural gas and the third largest producer in the world of crude oil. So because of the war, Ukraine has not been able to export the amount of grain that it produces. It is piling up in warehouses and in silos. They have not been able to replant because of the war going on. I mean, you see it on television. The Russians are bombing out them daylights. So they haven't been able to get on with the business of planting for the next crop. And therefore the picture going forward is very bleak. And then, of course, the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia by America and by Europe have severely affected Russia's ability to export some of these essential commodities. They haven't sanctioned their oil because Europe depends heavily on Russian oil, but a number of the other things that Russia produces have been subject to sanctions. Last month, inflation here in Jamaica was almost 18% compared to what it was last year this time. In America and England, they are having inflation problems too. They are running at about 9%. Ours is about 11%. They are running at about 9%. Fuel prices here in Jamaica have increased by 35% over the last 12 months. 35%. And that drives up the cost of production and distribution of the things we buy at the shops. It's not only here in Jamaica. In America, a gallon of gas that was costing less than $2 per gallon 2 years ago. Today that is now costing over $5 a gallon, American dollars. It is important for us to understand what is happening and what is causing it. When prices keep going up, people blame the government. Their government, wherever those people are, whether here, America, England, Europe. In America, they say it's Joe Biden's fault. He must deal with it. In England, they're vexed with Boris Johnson. And as a matter of fact, in England, they have been having street demonstrations now over the last couple of days, if not weeks, all over the country. People complaining about the cost of living. Sometimes when prices keep going up, it really is the government's fault. It may be that the government is spending more than the taxes that it collects. That is what is called fiscal deficit. And when it does that, it must either print money, which drives up inflation, or borrow money, which also can have an impact on inflation if your debt is too high. And when that happens, prices go up to balance things out. Sometimes the government puts too much money in circulation so that you have more money chasing the same amount of goods and services. When that happens, prices go up too to balance it out. But here in Jamaica, we had pretty much fixed those problems. We eliminated the fiscal deficit. In other words, we were spending less than the taxes we collected. And we were using the surplus to pay down our debt. And that was going pretty well up until COVID. The Bank of Jamaica was carefully managing money supply to ensure that we didn't have too much money chasing the amount of goods and services in the market. What the government cannot do is to control the price of wheat that we have to import to make the bread that we eat every day, or the corn that we import to make the animal feeds, to produce the chicken that we eat, if not every day, every week. And when the price of those imports go up, the price you pay in the supermarket and in the grocery shop automatically goes up. So the inflation we are experiencing is not inflation that we ourselves have caused. This is not homegrown inflation. It is inflation that we have imported. And it is particularly severe in Jamaica because we have to import so many things. So much of what we eat, so much of what we use has to be imported. Let's drive down to the wharf down at Port Bustamante and look and see all the containers there, loaded up. That is stuff that we are importing. We are a heavy importing country, and because of that, if inflation is taking place abroad, that inflation is coming in the containers that is a pile up down there. What is extremely worrying is that it seems that it is going to get worse before it starts to get better. There is talk in America now that they are on the verge of a recession. And we know from experience what effects a recession in America has on us here in Jamaica. I had to deal with it between 2007 and 2009 when I was Prime Minister. Production goes down and prices go up because people still have to live, they still have to eat. So lower production of critical commodities and the same demand because people have to live, they have to eat, results in higher prices. It dries up foreign investment. So it puts pressure on our foreign exchange flows. And it causes devaluation, which pushes prices up even further because so much of what we consume has to be imported with US dollars. Businesses come under pressure and are forced to lay off workers, causing unemployment to rise. Then to make matters worse, we are now seeing some never-before-seen changes in weather patterns. People like Donald Trump say that that climate change is a hoax. Well, you know, they're talking rubbish, pure rubbish. We saw in America last week massive floods in Montana. The worst, they say, in 500 years. But at the same time, we saw record heat waves in other parts of America. Right next door to Montana, in Oregon. Right next door, Montana was having massive floods. And next door in Oregon, they were having record high temperatures. What's going on? The same thing is happening in Europe. Massive floods in some parts of France, but record high temperatures in other parts of France. Spain and Portugal are suffering unbearable heat of over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. You know, where was it? Somewhere in Kentucky last week. Temperatures reach 109 degrees. No, it can get hot in Jamaica, you know, hot bad. On one or two occasions, I recall, we went a little over 100 degrees. On one occasion, I remember we reached 101. And that was like you were sitting on top of a stove. Can you imagine what 109 degrees means? 109 degrees. And I saw the weather report this morning on CNN, where they're predicting that several cities this week will experience temperatures of over 100. Then there's the problem of drought. Unprecedented drought in parts of Europe, in Asia, Africa, and America. There's a state, I can't remember which one, where they said that a river that is critical to their water supply, that river had fallen by lost something like 12 feet. The river is drying up, and that's the river that they depend on for water. And it's affecting not just people in terms of their drinking water, but the farmers don't have water now to irrigate their crops. So all of that is going to put pressure on prices, because if drought harms the crop, and they're not able to produce as much as they would normally produce, then you're going to have price increases. This is the scenario we are facing right now. What can we do about it? Are there policies that the government can pursue that would lessen the impact on Jamaica? Ease the price increases at the supermarket and grocery shops? What does this mean for us in the long term, in terms of achieving sturdy economic growth, creating jobs, reducing poverty, making Jamaica a nice place to live, as Tony Rebel would say? We're going to delve into this issue today. It is an important issue, and we're going to talk with some experts who can help us to better understand the underlying factors. What is it that is at play? And what can we do about it? What should we do about it? That's our discussion for today. And as I said, we have some people who I believe can really help us to understand what's going on. I'm very pleased to bring on as our first guest today Professor Densil Williams, who is the Pro-Vice-Chancellor at the University of the West Indies. Do we have him on? Professor Williams?
Hi, good morning, Prime Minister Golden. How are you?
How are you, Prof?
I am good, thank you. Good to hear you, and good morning to the listeners as well.
Good. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good.
I want you to help us to understand. You know, we went through a period of about 5 years, I believe, before COVID, when prices were so stable that the Bank of Jamaica started expressing concern that we don't have enough inflation.
Yes.
Now price increases are juking out our eyeball every week we go to the supermarket. What is happening?
Yes, thanks. So, I heard your earlier commentary, PM, about this local situation. But as you would know, this is the double whammy that we face, because, yes, you have local conditions that may cause increase in prices, but you also have imported inflation, as you know, based on what is also going on in the global arena. So just today, for example, you're learning that Russia is now blocking grains from being exported out of the Ukraine. And as you know, if that is a situation, that is going to lead to a shortage on the global marketplace, because as you know, Ukraine, I think, is one of the largest producers of grains, and grains is used into a number of things, especially starchy food that you eat. So your bread, your flour, all these kinds of things. So if there is a shortage on the world market, then typical demand and supply, you're expecting prices to go up as well. So there are those factors that we have to look at. Similarly, the price of oil and those kinds of things still at play, although, as you would appreciate, oil is not at a particular high. But, boy, you're starting to wonder how high can it go, yeah? And you kind of see that the market's starting to price those things in already, because if you recognize in April of this year, you follow the numbers very closely, but when you look at monthly inflation in April, you recognize that there was kind of disinflation. We actually had a negative inflation in April. In May, it came back up by about 0.3%. Point-to-point inflation is also reducing between April and May. April, it was about 11.8. By May, it came down to 10.85. So what you're seeing is that the rate of change of price is actually not that drastic, because prices are so high. But what is happening is that the prices now are still at a high level. And as the Economist would say, the prices are sticky downwards. So they are so high that it is still causing problems to people. And that is really what now you have to deal with, the high price level. So you may not see a significant change in terms of the rate of increase in prices over the next few months, because they're already so high.
You
unless
sure
something drastic really happens. Yeah?
You're sure you're not talking too soon? Because
Well, that's the point.
I'm hearing
Notice my
sounds.
caution unless something drastic happens. Yes?
I'm hearing sounds in the U.S. about
Yes.
the possibility of recession. Now, President Biden said recession is not inevitable, but the question is whether or not it is likely, because if the Feds have to move up interest rates further, which I think is quite likely,
Yes.
then they're not likely to avoid recession, are they? Because
that's
economic
the point.
activity is going to be discouraged.
Right. But that's the point I was getting at. So I made a very serious caution that despite the prices are not so high already, and you're asking where else can you go, I made a caution that some turbulence are still on the horizon. As I said, you don't know what direction the Ukraine war may turn. It may even get worse, and as a result of that, then you will see prices even moving much higher. Now going to the U.
Then of course, add to that as well,
yeah.
and I mentioned it. Add to that as well the kind of strange weather patterns we're seeing in some of the major food-producing areas.
Absolutely, which can cause shortage of food as well. So those are factors that we can look at. But going back to the U.S., you're correct. My reading is that, remember now, the U.S. had a massive stimulus package
Yes.
during the COVID period. That has overheated the U.S. economy in a way. So as a result of that, they now have to try to cool down that economy, and that is why I think you're also spot on to say that I expect the Fed to also increase rate at their next meeting as well. But the question with that now is that when that happens, what kind of signal that is going to send into economies like ours? The truth is that we can't follow the exact same thing that the U.S. is doing. You know why? When I just look at some rough numbers, PM, and see where we were in 2019, to this day, we have not reached our 2019 level of GDP, despite the fact that we would have grown about 8% in 2020.
Yeah, we're catching back up.
Right, so we're catching back up. So when I look at those numbers, we don't reach up to 2019 level as yet. We now have to make sure that the Jamaican economy can get there and surpass it. Now, where we are, if we are expecting to see things are tightening like they are now, we're not expecting an 8% growth. We're going to be expecting a 2.5%, 3% growth. If that is the case, we are not reaching 2019 levels until about 2024, 2025.
Well,
so what we can't do is to have fiscal and monetary policies being tight in Jamaica as we now have it, because that in and of itself will lead to a recession, as you would appreciate, because right now the government is projecting to run a fiscal surplus. Now, if that is the case, it simply means that fiscal policy is tight. And if the Bank of Jamaica continues to increase interest rate, it means that monetary policy is tight as well. So the two levers that you have to actually stimulate the economy, you're going to be in a little bit of bother if you continue in that tight space. So we have to just see them easing off of one of those policy levers.
I'm glad you got there, because I wanted to pose a question to you.
Yeah.
What are the policy options that are open to us, whether in terms of the independent central bank or in terms of the government and its fiscal arrangements? The reason why I want to explore that is because if we're faced with inflation, which, as you know, that is where the rubber hits the ground, no? That is where people feel it.
Right.
What other option would the Bank of Jamaica have? And it is their responsibility to deal with inflation. What tools they have other than moving interest rates? Because the other tools, I think, would be even more severe.
Well, that's the thing. So you have the interest rate tool that you can use to deal with the money supply. But when you look at things like, buying back bonds and all those kinds of things to get some of the money out of the marketplace, that also can help. But I don't think the challenge that you have, PM, is about how you move in the interest rate, because something has to happen there, but it's the aggressiveness of it. Yeah. So when you're moving the interest rate by 150 basis points, for example, that is a really, really aggressive step. So if you notice what the Fed did in the first instance, they moved it by about 25 basis points. Yeah, and see the impact that it's going to have and stuff like that. And then it is the first time, I think, in 40 years that they move it by 75 basis points. Notice in Jamaica, we move it by almost 150 basis points in one go. Yeah, and then subsequent to that, we're moving it by 50 basis points, etc. So what we now have to do is to start to recalibrate and say how much basis points can still give us, one, the impact on inflation, but also stimulate the economy in such a way that we don't push it into a recession. That's the balancing act that has to happen at the Bank Bank of Jamaica right now. And then on the fiscal side, you have to start to look and say, really and truly, should you be tight in fiscal policies so much that you have to run a surplus right now in environments like this? That's a question that you have to answer, because yes, it is true that the macroeconomic program is anchored on fiscal discipline, as you know more than most people, yeah. But the question is that in a time like this, when things are getting so tight, and as you said, the ordinary man on the ground, can you actually afford to run a fiscal surplus, and how big that surplus ought to be? Yeah, because at some point you're going to have to do conditional cash transfer to support families. Yeah,
but if you don't have that fiscal surplus, then it means that you would have to revise your debt reduction targets.
Correct. So the question is, should you be running to a debt reduction target by 2026, 2027, or could you stress the target a little bit further? Because what happens, is that you have credibility, and it's not that person's now in the capital market going to see you as profligate, because they know that you have the credibility. But the question becomes, how do you use that credibility in a way that is judicious and doesn't seem like you're running with it? You follow? And that is the balancing act that you have to actually you have to do, because those two levers are the main levers that you have right now. So should we run a tight fiscal ship and make sure we meet the debt target later on, earlier than normal? But then what you have is a situation where you have chaos in the street, where people can't afford food, where the prices are so high, and the most vulnerable people are being left behind and stuff. That's the balancing act that you have to make.
Well, part of the problem with that credibility issue, and I think you would appreciate how important it is, given where we're coming from over the last several decades, no?
Yes.
But part of the problem with that credibility issue is that if you decide that the circumstances require you to ease off, to kind of reschedule your targets and so on, and you were to end up with an Article 4 IMF assessment that is negative, wouldn't that do a lot of damage to that credibility?
Here why I don't.
Because, for example, the IMF is still raising hell about our wage to GDP target.
Yes.
And quite frankly, I don't know that we can achieve that target unless we're going to start laying off some policemen and some teachers and some nurses.
And in the context of public sector reform that is going on now, that target seems highly unlikely. But here why I don't have a deep concern about, say, an Article 4 agreement, PM, that is going to give you maybe a negative rating or so. As you correctly identified, compared to, say, 3-4 decades ago where we're coming from, you would appreciate the significant institutional gains that we have made in terms of our fiscal management. It was under you, for example, the fiscal responsibility framework came into being, right? So we have the fiscal responsibility law. We are now talking about a fiscal council. We're now talking about an independent central bank. Those institutions have credibility that will allow us not to so much run off rail as we didn't have before. Yes? And because of that credibility, because of those institutional advancements that we have made, I still think that what it has done now is to give us greater credibility in the marketplace. Yeah, to say that, listen, they're not just going to run with it; it must be circumstance driven. Yeah, because as you know, to get these things going, for example, you have to go to Parliament, amend the fiscal responsibility law. Everything becomes transparent. Yeah, it's not, you can't just have a Minister of Finance signing off things anymore.
A big question, though, Densil, is going to be how long are we going to be in this hole? Are we still sliding down the hole, or we are at the bottom now and we can start climbing out? Because if this thing is going to endure, and indications are that it is, Russia is not planning to leave Ukraine anytime soon.
Exactly.
The U.S. may, no matter how Biden talks, the U.S. may find that in another couple of months, it is very much in a recession.
Mm-hmm.
If we get into a situation now where we're looking almost at a 2007, 2009 scenario, where you're dealing with 2 years of unpleasantness,
yes,
how could we manage during that period to pull down those targets without doing serious damage to the progress that we have made over the last 6-7 years?
Right, and that is where now if you think about it, that is where now you're going to have some level of domestic activity that is going to have to drive the economic activities going on. Yeah, so you're going to have to look to major sectors now that can actually drive some activities for employment, job creation, etc. So your tourism going to have to come into play. Yes, your construction sector going to have to come into play. Your agricultural sector going to have to come into play. So the Ministry of Agriculture are going to have to step up its game in a significant way, yeah, in order to cushion some of these impact. Your construction sector will have to come into play. And again, that is why the BOJ now will have to also rethink the aggressive nature of its monetary policy, because remember, part of the thing that you saw with the expansion in the construction sector, for example, interest rates were so low and people were able to now get approval for mortgages, etc. Remember, when you add 150 basis points to a mortgage payment, that's a whole heap of money. Yeah. So if you think about it, the BOJ now has to think about the pass-through effect of the aggressive monetary policy on other sectors like construction and stuff. So now when you think about going forward, you have to say, listen, in an environment like this, can we continue with a tight monetary policy that is going to impact on that kind of sector? But what we really, really need is, as I said before, some domestic levers now going to have to be pulled in order to move job creation, in order to move the kind of growth that you need to see in the economy. And I think tourism is going to be one, construction is one, agriculture is one, the BPO sector is there, and the creative sector. But that will take some time to build up and kind of generate the kind of activities that you need.
You seem to be suggesting that you would be open to, for example, using some of that surplus to incentivize farmers to increase domestic food supply. Is that the kind of policy option that you would be prepared to recommend?
I would go even a bit further. Farmers, small businesses, etc. What you'll have to do is to also have a carve out for small businesses, because as you would appreciate, a significant amount of activities will take place in the small business sector. So you know what I'm suggesting, PM, that you could do? B2B operation. Well, let me just break it down a little bit for our listeners. So business-to-business operations, as you would know, is one of the greatest source of revenue for small businesses, yeah? Because despite the success of small business, I'm doing some work on it now, yeah? The big small businesses that normally succeed, you know what actually lead to their greatest success? Business-to-business operation. And business-to-business in this regard doesn't mean just only private sector. The government can be seen as a major source of business for small and medium enterprises, right? Because what happens, is that these B2B, they make decisions maybe once a year. All right, and therefore you will know you get a big contract from the government, or you get a big contract from Grace Kennedy, or LaSalle's or something as a small business. So you know your revenues and stuff. Yes, you will have some B2C, some small customers that are going around and stuff, but the bulk of your business coming from B2B. So what I'm suggesting here, if we're starting to think about it, one of the greatest source of B2B in terms of small businesses, the government will have to make a big effort in that regard. And the government should be having carve-out in their budget, not preferential treatment now, but carve-out to say, listen, this portion of all our procurement, etc., is going to go to small businesses within our Jamaican economy. They can now bid for projects, they can do the relevant things and stuff like that, upgrade their capacity so that they get these projects and keep the engine of the economy going. That, to me, is an area that we need to focus on, where government is making a concerted effort to support small businesses.
But wouldn't this kind of pumping up, wouldn't that also have inflationary impact?
If you pump up the small business in that way?
If you pumping up small businesses or doing cash transfers to the most vulnerable, doesn't that all have implications for inflation too?
Yeah, it will, but the point is that is really the balancing act that you have to look at. I mean, if you put too much money in the economy and there's no goods to support it, then you're definitely going to have the inflationary impact. So what we are suggesting is that you can calibrate it, and you can say how much of a conditional transfer that you need to actually make and stuff like that. What is the quantum that the economy can actually accept at a particular point in it? Because all these things are modeled, so you will know what quantum of cash you can put in the economy at what particular point in time to see the kinds of inflation. But what we're saying is that what you don't want is that the economic activities are slowing down, so you can't get the job creation, you can't get the kind of growth that you need.
In other words,
that is going to be small businesses.
In other words, what you're saying, we can't just batten down and wait till the hurricane passes, huh?
No, not at all. If you make that kind of mistake, what is going to happen is that the hurricane will pass and you will never be able to revive.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you have to put proactive policies in place from now, and that is one of the things that I think that we need to start looking at. Is a piece of work that I'm looking at about B2B operations and small business. Just Saturday, I was having a meeting with a major banker in this country, and what they told me is that, listen, it is 10% of our customers really give us about 95% of our profits. Yeah? That's what they said to me, say 10% of those customers, and those are normally the B2B customers, yeah, give us 95% of our profits, yeah? So although you go to these banks, PM, and you see these long lines in the banks and stuff, a lot of the time the banks subsidizing those customers, you know that?
Well, you tell me. We're out of time. Professor Densil Williams, thanks a whole lot for joining me. You have helped us to get this discussion going off to a good start. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Bye-bye. Thank you. Good.
Bye-bye.
Start your morning with
Welcome back. It's Jamaica Live. We're on Bridge 99. Today we're talking about global economic developments and what implications they have for us here in Jamaica. What are the policy options open to us? We're very pleased now to be joined by Dr. Damien King, who is a lecturer in economics at the University of the West Indies and also executive director of the Caribbean Policy Research Institute. Dr. King, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Mr. Golding. It's my pleasure to be with you as always.
Good, and thank you so much for joining us. Damien, inflation is hitting us. Prices are rising, but they're not just hitting us. Inflation is going on all around us. The Bank of Jamaica has raised interest rates, but then interest rates are going up all around us too. Russia doesn't appear to be in a hurry to get out of Ukraine. We're having some weird weather developments, floods in one part of America and right next door, heat wave, which all seem likely to disrupt critical food production. Is there cause for us to be alarmed?
We need to perhaps do some editing to Charles Dickens' famous opening line. It is the worst of times. It is the worst of times. The global forces working against a small, open, developing country are concerning. You have mentioned some of them. Supply chain bottlenecks continue to gum up global trade. The war in Ukraine is causing all manner of consequences beyond its own borders on commodity prices, for one, but more importantly, on the recognition of geopolitical risk. And that only adds to a heightening appreciation of geopolitical risk brought about by the former U.S. President Trump's attitude towards China, as well as President Xi Jinping of China's own behavior in terms of his increasing tight management of its own economy. And he's taking strategic actions to protect their own industrial development and security. So all of that is itself affecting global prospects. And what is more, leading to a quite serious systemic structural realignment of global trade, a rapid retreat from the globalization that we had seen growing for decades up until recently. Security and reliability now become more important concerns in supply chain than is mere efficiency and, the cheapest global supplier.
I had thought that by now the disruption in the supply chain would have sorted themselves out. Why haven't they?
Well, the disruptions in the supply chain are going to sort themselves out at some point because there is money to be made by doing so. But this realignment of global trade recognizing that supply chains cannot be as far-flung and as reliable as we once thought, is a permanent shift. And that is going to lead to more protectionism, more industrial policy, and therefore a less efficient world, meaning a higher cost world. So some of that is going to retain. As you also mentioned, of course, this bout of inflation is causing global interest rates to go up, local interest rates to go up, and that is certainly going to bring in a pretty steep global recession over the next couple of years.
Given our vulnerabilities that you know better than most of us, but also given the trajectory that we have been on for the last 6-7 years, what options are open to us? What options we could consider, and what options we dare not even look at?
Well, it's an appropriate moment to recognize and appreciate the efforts of Jamaican government over the last 7-8 years, as you have mentioned, and how it has put us in a position of some amount of resilience in the face of what is going on. If people want an idea of what Jamaica could have been like if it had not done the tremendous fiscal adjustment that it did under the 2 IMF programs, then just have a look at what is happening in Sri Lanka. That is the alternative history for Jamaica, had it not done what it did. And that gave us an ability to withstand the pandemic without the society and all public services collapsing.
How do we make sure that we don't reverse that?
Well, we need to continue doing the positive things that have happened recently, which is responsible fiscal management. That has served us well to survive this, and we need to continue to pay attention to that. We can't let the pressures that we're facing globally cause us to take our eye off the importance of fiscal sustainability. And going back to rising public debt, half of which is external debt, and makes us more vulnerable to global downturns and to higher interest rates. So first of all, we need to continue the impressive fiscal responsibility of the last 8 years. And it is truly impressive what Jamaica has done. Secondly, we need to continue to invest in the solid monetary policies and monetary management that Jamaica has now gotten onto with its independent central bank and its inflation targeting. It makes times rough in the short term, but it gives us the kind of improved climate for investment that's going to serve us better in the long term. So essentially, to continue to focus on the economic fundamentals. And focusing on the economic fundamentals also gives us the room to be able to mitigate short-term problems. But that is not to say that there's anything that we can do for us to believe that the global downturn that is coming and the external shocks that are coming, Jamaica is not going to feel them.
Is there any room at all without reversing the gains? Is there any room at all to loosen some of the laces?
Well, there is a little room, but not much. You don't want to get to a situation where it looks like we're not going to meet our debt reduction target, because that makes investors, and when I say investors, I don't mean some foreign guy who has a lot of money already. I mean even local investment. That makes investors cautious and they pull back on investment, and therefore that affects our productivity in the long run. We have a healthy amount of foreign reserves at the Bank of Jamaica, close to $4 billion. If anything goes awry too quickly and too strongly in the global economy, we can call upon that. But again, we don't want to run that down too much because that reserve gives us confidence. So we need to appreciate that we do have some room, but as I said, we are going to be facing the consequences of the negative global forces that are upon us.
For example, just to toss this out, we're facing a situation of rising food prices, which is partly linked to food shortages globally. Could the government responsibly consider, for example, providing some kind of incentives to the local agricultural sector to get into the field and plant up as much as you can? Is that the kind of thing that the government ought to be looking at?
Well, this speaks to the fact that as a society, and this goes back to independence, we have consistently, to a large degree, failed to look after those in the society who are most vulnerable to something like rising food prices. Rising food prices, of course, affects everybody, but it affects those for whom food makes up a large portion of their budget far more. And we have just been inadequate and almost immoral in not having in place these automatic social safety nets and protection for the poorest in the society. And this is just another, we saw it in the pandemic. We've seen it in every crisis before this, and we're seeing it again. We need to automatically, not be thinking about now, rising food prices are going up. What can we do? We need to have better mechanisms to look after the poorest in the society. Having said that, the problem with incentivizing local agricultural production is that local agricultural production struggles because it is not internationally competitive. It is high cost. And you're not getting around that high cost by providing fiscal incentives, You're just moving the cost to the budget. And then the government has to find ways to, increase taxes to finance that. So it's not really an easy out.
Is there any response that you feel that the government, apart from what Minister Clark has outlined, is there any response that you feel that the government ought to look at seriously? Bearing in mind that this thing looks as if it's not going away anytime soon. What's it, for example, Damien, is the U.S. heading into a recession?
Almost certainly.
And what
along with the rest of the world.
What implications that would have for us here?
U.S. recessions and global recessions have implications for us because we are necessarily an open economy. Because we're a small economy, trade makes up half of our economic activity. So it's going to mean higher prices for a lot of what we import. It's going to mean a fall off in a lot of how we earn our foreign exchange, bauxite, tourism, fewer tourists. So it's going to impact us. And there is no, when global forces go against us, there is no avoiding the consequence for us. What we need to do is just to protect as much as we can the poorest and the neediest and the most vulnerable.
So, in other words, the approach so far seemed to be primarily a demand side kind of approach. Is there anything that we can do to stimulate production during this crisis?
Well, we're doing it.
Economic activity?
We're doing it. We can stimulate. We're stimulating economic activity by our tremendous investment in the road infrastructure, which we've been doing now for nearly a decade. Well, for longer than that, and we continue to do. One of the most important things you can do for production is to make it cheaper and easier to transport people and cargo. So that is on the way. But it doesn't make sense but the higher interest rates are necessarily going to work against that. And it's a kind of a devil's bargain to not do that. Because if you don't raise interest rates and then inflation continues rising, the problem you have then is that the exchange rate goes back to its inexorable upward spiral. And that kind of uncertainty over the exchange rate mitigates against long-term investment. So you kind of ease it up in the short run, but it really hurts you in the long run.
So what you're basically saying is that we have to just batten down.
Well, but the hurricane is not an inapplicable metaphor. There's nothing you can do that's going to make it look like the hurricane don't hit you at all. But battening down can prevent the worst of the damage.
Mm. When you were on this program the last time, we had a discussion about cryptocurrency. Give me your thoughts in terms of what has happened to that.
I said at the time that cryptocurrency is not an investment in the same way you think of stocks and bonds and real estate, which is not to say that people shouldn't buy cryptocurrency. But you buy cryptocurrency for the same reason that you like to go to Cayman Park. The exercise of the gamble itself might give you some kind of enjoyment. And that's fine for people who want that. But an investment that gives you a return that you can sort of calculate an expected value and know whether it's a good or bad investment, you can't do that with crypto. It's too new, it's too volatile, it's too dynamic a space. And so what is happening to it now is perfectly consistent with that.
Is it going to be able to survive?
Well, digital assets are going to survive. There's no question about that. Digital assets confer a tremendous advantage. It's an advantage that Jamaica is now going to be taking advantage of with its digital currency. But whether any particular investment in it, any particular token, ends up surviving is unclear. But the long-term, the long-term prospects for digital assets in the world economy and in society are solid.
I saw over the weekend on the news channels about the hundreds of flight cancellations daily in the United States. Is this and I gather that is likely to continue. Is this likely to affect our tourism sector? Bear in mind, of course, that a lot of the tourists that come here come via charters, which may not be affected, although they might be. But do you think that this is the worst time ever for us to have any hiccups in the tourism sector?
Well, I mean, as long as the tourists still want to come, the flights are going to be on. So it's not going to affect us as much as you otherwise might think. But I'll tell you, it's a good point to remember. As you will recall, the decision for the government to divest itself of a national airline was not one easily taken and came with a lot of opposition. But subsequent events in the global economy, with the pandemic, with oil prices, have revealed that decision is one that has saved Jamaica a tremendous amount of headache, financial costs, and difficulties. So congratulations to the government that made that decision.
Yeah, but in terms of, well, I don't know why I'm kind of still worried about it, because I gather a lot of the flight cancellations are due to lack of staff. It's not so much lack of passengers, it's lack of staff. They just don't have the pilots. I don't know what has happened. I don't know whether this is still the remnants of COVID or what, but hundreds of, by hundreds I mean, I think the figure for yesterday was something like 900 flights cancelled all across the United States.
Yeah, there are some supply issues with the industry, and it's not to say it's not going to affect them. But as you pointed out, a lot of the traffic here comes by charters and by cruise, so it's going to affect us. But the prospects for the tourism industry are not dire at this point.
The last time we had a major recession in the United States was 2007, no? And that lasted pretty much almost 2 years.
Yeah.
What is your crystal ball telling us about this time around?
I mean, the duration I have in my head is 2 years, but that is not because of any divining of proprietary statistics or great wisdom. It's because that is generally the duration of recession. So I have not thought about any particularities of this one that would make me want to bet a whole lot of money on the accuracy of that.
So basically, our return to the pre-COVID GDP levels, we may as well put that off another 2 years, no?
Well, we've recovered most of it, I mean, we're only, at the worst, we were down about 20%, and we are now back within 5%, probably a little more than that, of pre-COVID levels. And so, yeah, the recession is going to set us back. But I do think that because of the aforementioned policy improvements and reforms that Jamaica has invested in over the last 8 years, I think the prospects for Jamaica's economy beyond the coming global recession are quite strong.
Big challenges for us to survive
Indeed.
until then.
Indeed, nationally and individually.
Yeah, Dr. Damien King, thank you so much for coming on today. Really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure, Mr. Golden.
Yeah, we take the break. Welcome back. It's Jamaica Live. We're on Bridge 99. Coming to you from Kingston. We should be linking around now. We should be linking with New York. I don't think we have them on yet, but as soon as we do, we'll have a chat with Beauregard and see what's happening over on his side of the waters. Today we're talking about current global economic developments and what are the implications for Jamaica. What are the policy options that are open to us? Have we made use of them? And we started the program in a discussion with Professor Densil Williams, who is the Pro-Vice-Chancellor at University of the West Indies. He offered us a particular view. He feels that we can't just batten down. We have to use some of the assets that we have built up over the last 7-8 years in terms of the fiscal surplus, in terms of the credibility that we have in the financial markets. We have to basically put those on the table, put those at risk in order to minimize the impact of the current economic downturn. And then we had a talk with Dr. Damien King, who is a lecturer in economics, and he takes a completely different view. He basically says we dare not do that because that will set us back, so that even when the recession has passed, we may find ourselves in a worse position because we have put ourselves so far back behind the 8th ball. What he's saying is that those assets are what will enable us to come out of the starting blocks after the recession has passed, after the current global situation. I keep talking about recession, but Dr. King believes, and I share his view, now no matter how President Joe Biden may try to wish it away, America is headed into a recession, and recessions normally have a 2-year cycle. So you're talking about, we are what now, 2022, 2023, 2024. We're going to be facing a recession. Of course, that is going to have serious implications for us here in Jamaica. And his view is that if a storm is coming, you can't divert the storm. You can't say, well, this is what I'm going to do to fight back the storm. You can't fight it. What you have to do is to protect yourself from it. What you have to do basically is to batten down to make sure that it don't tear off your roof. And his view is that that is the position that we are in, and that is the position that we should continue to hold to. We want to move this discussion on some more, and I'm pleased to be joined now by Mr. Dennis Chung, who is an economist, a public commentator. He has very considered views on topics like these. Dennis, welcome to the program.
Hi, PM. How are you doing?
I'm good.
Mm-hmm.
You know what is happening here. You know what is happening abroad. you are in a position to see what seems to be lying down the road. Are we in deep trouble?
It's going to be a difficult time for us, and I've maintained that from the start of the year. It's going to be difficult, not just because of the inflationary environment that we're in now, but remember, we're coming from a COVID situation, and the economy is not back to pre-COVID levels. So there's some amount of hurt already happening, and I think it's going to be even more difficult now with the inflation. So we're in a bit of a spot because government revenues have not recovered yet. I mean, I speak, for example, of services. So even if I look at the situation with NSW and the garbage trucks, that, we're getting 50 of 100 that we're supposed to get 2 years ago, and we're reading it 150. So services are going to be affected, I think, from the government point of view. And from a personal point of view, individuals are going to start feeling it, particularly those persons who have variable interest rate loans on their books, whether businesses or individuals. So they're going to see a rise in cost of their payments back, and their revenues are going to fall because there's going to be less money in the economy for expenditure. And the economy is very dependent on imported goods. So it's going to be a very difficult time for us.
Well, it's one thing then is if people are facing rising prices and rising mortgage rates and so on. But do you see a downturn in the economy that will end up with people being laid off? Because it's one thing to have to cope with the inflation, but if you have to cope with the inflation when you don't have a job.
Yeah, it's highly possible that will happen because if people have less money to spend, then it means that businesses are going to earn less money. And if businesses earn less money, then, they're going to a loss, or if they have loans on their books that they can't service, then they're inevitably going to have to lay off people, in that situation. So it's going to be a very tricky situation. And the truth is that this will persist for as long as the war happens in Europe. And the longer it happens, the worse it's going to get, because it means that it's going to be harder to recover from it. Mm-hmm. So the biggest hope that we can have is that there's some end to the war. Based on where things are right now, I don't see any end in sight right now. So I know the BOJ had predicted that inflation will be high to the rest of the end of the year, but if the war continues for quite a bit of time towards the end of the year, we could be looking into next year that will have a high inflation, and we can't deal with that. I mean, you see, we've had to increase interest rates aggressively up to 5%. The U.S. in the last interest rate increase had a 75 basis point increase, which is the highest they've done, I think, in about 40 years. So
I want to follow you up on that, but can I ask you to just hold, because I want to link with New York now. Beauregard.
Okay. Good afternoon, Mr. Golden.
How are you doing? How are the people up in New York?
Everyone is okay. I'm hoping, Mr. Golden, it's a youth celebration here after the Father's Day weekend. Yeah. Today everybody's celebrating Juneteenth, so that's a huge day here in the United States. It was made a federal holiday last year by the president, but it was COVID, so this year the celebration should be different.
And beg you, just tell them some Jamaican people out here are begging them. Nobody gonna shoot up nobody over there, yeah, man.
No.
Too much of that going on. But tell me, today we're talking about inflation and how it is affecting people and what seems to be waiting for us down the road. This seems to be a big issue in America now, isn't it?
Definitely, sir. The inflation is affecting all areas, all markets right now.
How much a gallon you have to pay for gas now, Bo?
The average price is close to $6 right now.
Close to $6?
Yes, close to $6. At least $5.50, somewhere around there.
2 years ago, it was $2.
Yes, it was. Definitely was, and prices are raising. You see inflation taking place all over the country, all over the world. Actually, even here in the United States, they are now saying that we should prepare ourselves and stock up on food, just in case for emergency situations. Even Costco is offering a food bucket right now, emergency food supply bucket. And they have them by the thousands there. So I don't know what they're expecting, but they're saying prepare ourselves.
So are people hurting, or people are fearing that they're going to hurt?
I'm sure people are hurting since the pandemic came in, and then the inflation, the war has been affecting everybody. The war in Ukraine, that's a cause for a lot of the inflation and things that we see, the food shortages that we see taking place all over the world right now. So,
do they have any cushion over there, Bo? I mean, for example, to deal with the rising food prices, is there any kind of government assistance they can get?
I'm sure the government has some money somewhere put on to help out the citizens of the country. It's just to get us to let them go into it and to use up some of that emergency money for good causes.
And then, of course, you don't know how long it's going to be.
No, we don't.
President Biden says that inflation is not inevitable, but I believe inflation is very likely. That's not inflation, recession. I think it's very likely. What do you think?
I'm hoping that we don't go back to something that we call the Great Depression back in the 20s.
No, I don't think you'll go back that far, but you may go back to what you had in 2007.
True indeed.
Which was not nice.
No, it wasn't. Thankfully, we had a president that worked towards helping the citizens at the time, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course, he had a Congress there that was cooperative, certainly for the first 2 years of his tenure. I don't know what's likely to happen after November, but you're a resilient people, so you will survive.
Yes, we will.
Hail up all the Jamaicans up there for me.
I'll do that, sir.
Good. We're back now with Mr. Dennis Chung, Economist. Dennis, tell me, am I correct that a recession in America is very likely?
Yeah, it's very, very likely. Because with gas prices where they are, food prices where they are, you're going to see spending coming down. The consumers, more than 50% of consumers think that things are going to get worse there. So it means that consumer spending is going to go down. Once that starts happening, it means that businesses are going to start feeling it and production is going to go down. So I don't see how they're going to avoid it, to be honest with you.
And do you expect that the Fed is going to push interest rates up for even further? Because that, of course, would have a negative impact on economic activity, no?
Yeah, man. If inflation continues as is, then definitely I think you're going to see more. And the fact that they've gone up 75 basis points in the last sitting, which is significant, it to me suggests that there's going to be further increases coming in interest rates, which means that ours is going to go up too.
Well, let us come back home. In terms of dealing with inflation, what other options does the Bank of Jamaica have?
Well, the BOJ doesn't really have much other options, What we have is fiscal policy options that we can pursue. So if you think about it, the problem comes about because people lack money, right, and people lack disposable income. We have always had a chance to improve the disposable income of our people that we have not taken, and that is to provide proper public transportation. Because if we do provide proper public transportation, then what it means is that people can start putting their money into public transportation and get rid of owning cars, buying fuel, and that sort of thing. So that, for me, has always been the way that we can do it.
But those are not emergency options, though. Those are long-term things.
Those are things that will take some time, and that's why I was just going to go and say, can we do it right now? No, I don't think we can do it enough now, but we should start. We should have started this years ago, and then would have been in a much better position now. As to what we can do short term, I don't think that there's much that we can do short term. The government doesn't have the revenue, right? So
let me put the issue to you now. Because before you came on, I had on Professor Densil Williams, and then I had on Dr. Damien King. And I got two completely opposite ideas in terms of how we should respond. Densil was of the view that we really need to relax, revise some of our critical targets, like the primary surplus target, like the debt reduction targets, to give us some room to try to stimulate the economy to counteract the negative effect of what is happening. And he said he felt that we needed to be targeted in doing it, looking at the agricultural sector. You mentioned construction, tourism, those sectors that could keep us afloat. What I understood Damien to be saying is that we dare not do that, because if you do that, you're going to lose much of the gains that we have made over the last 7-8 years. You're going to do damage to your credibility, so that when this hurricane has passed, even if it takes another 2 years, the assets that we have that would have enabled us to come out of the starting blocks like a bullet, by that time we will have been we'll have so damaged our own credibility and capability that even when the recession has passed, we're limping out of the starting blocks. What's your view?
I agree with Damien King. I mean, I don't think that. I mean, if you think about even yourself personally, Mr. Golding, if you are faced with a more difficult situation, that's not the time to increase spending at home, because it means you're going to be in a worse situation when it ends. What we have to do is try as much as possible to see if we can weather the storm. And maybe one of the things that we can do is push more local agricultural production and consumption. So maybe this is the time to increase taxes on imported foods, so that we are pushing more local production, right? And that is how we're going to get jobs. That's how we're going to,
But that would only make the inflation gallop a little further, a little faster.
If you buy things from overseas. You understand? So if you look at processed foods from overseas, for example, should we be looking to consume those, or should we be pushing our local production?
But does our agricultural sector have the capability of responding quickly?
Well, that's the thing. I don't know. I mean, I don't have that expertise, but certainly that's something we need to look at. That's the only option I see really that we can take right now.
I asked Damien, for example, following up on the kind of discussion I had with Densil, I asked Damien whether or not the government should consider providing some incentives to our farmers to say to them that, look, there is a food shortage worldwide. Prices have jumped through the roof. Get into your field quickly and plant as fast as you can, and increase domestic supply of food so that we can feed ourselves without having to deal with the high price imported stuff. But his view was that all that you'd be doing is, because of the inefficiency in our agricultural sector, which is not something that I think you would dispute. He says all you would be doing would be transferring the burden to the budget, which means that is the taxpayers have to pay for that. So you'll be taking from the taxpayers out of one pocket in order to put it in another pocket.
Yeah, man, I agree with that. It would be. So what we should be doing is really putting a greater barrier on imported goods, which is why I said, maybe we should be looking at having taxes more on certain selected imported goods, and pushing it more. I mean, I agree that there's inefficiencies in our agricultural sector, but at least you get a little more value from it locally, and put our efforts into that as a government to try and bring some efficiencies from using technical resources and that sort of thing, and have targeted productions. Look more at cash crops, things that can come in quickly. But that's the only way I see. I don't see any other way for us out of it, and push things like the public transportation. And one of the things you can do, which I've always said, is not a matter of just buying buses and putting the system, but how can we organize with our private transport operators to create a proper public transportation system. We must be able to do that. It's not beyond us.
Yeah. Again, I think you're talking long term, though.
Yeah, well, it is medium to long term, but
I know the term gets shorter once you make the first start. No, but
yeah, exactly, and that's the point. We have to start because if we start and we even save, a few gallons of gas or fuel initially, that's still foreign exchange that we're saving. So the more that momentum develops, but we have to start. If we don't start, we'll never get there.
But looking ahead, though, Dennis. Let us say that by the fall, America is officially in recession.
Mm-hmm.
Russia don't seem to have any plans to leave Ukraine for now.
No.
We're seeing all over the world, in America, in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, some weird weather developments. Weird.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, massive floods in Montana, right next door in Oregon, record heat waves. All of that must affect production, particularly of food.
Mm-hmm.
Look as if we're going to be, this is a hurricane that is not passing over us. It's going to just sit on top of us for maybe at least 2 years.
It is going
in
to
that
sit
period,
on top.
Isn't it likely to start really affecting economic activity to the point where people start losing jobs, businesses have to lay off or go to business altogether? Isn't that where we're heading?
Yeah, that's where we're heading. And that's why I say we have to take our policy actions quickly on the fiscal side, so start, because we don't know how long it's going to last, so we need to start. And the biggest import that we have is oil. So we have to try to address those things. Public transportation is critical for us going forward if we're going to deal with this. There's no way we can escape that because oil is such a big import. Renewable energy also is critical, for us to do that. So as much things as possible that can make us self-sufficient, we need to start doing those things now. Right? And this is why I don't agree with the reduction on the tax on fuel, because it's only going to encourage greater consumption of oil from overseas, and that will drive our foreign exchange rate. And if our foreign exchange rate starts moving, that is a double whammy.
Yes. Dennis, can you just hold for me? Let me just take a break. I'll come right back to you. Welcome back. It's Jamaica Live. We're on Bridge 99. Today we're talking about the global economic situation and what implications it has for Jamaica. We've been talking with Mr. Dennis Chung. Dennis, do you know, over the last couple of weeks, there have been daily flight cancellations in America. We're talking about hundreds of cancellations each day.
Yes.
I believe on Saturday it was over 1,000. Yesterday it was 900 or something. And this apparently is due to some systemic problems within the airline business.
Yeah.
Shortage of pilots and all kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
Is this likely to affect our tourism arrivals?
Oh,
bearing in mind that a lot of our tourists come by charter. I don't know whether charters are also affected.
Yeah. No, definitely will affect us. If it continues. The good thing is that we've been seeing quite a bit of tourism recently, so you haven't really been hearing anybody crying out too much, but definitely would impact us. If it didn't have those cancellations, then you'd have more tourists here. So we're really losing revenue.
Well, that's not good, because if there ever was a time when we need tourism to be bubbling and all,
it's now. Yeah. But what has happened, is that since the pandemic, the equation has sort of shifted in terms of balance of power between employer and employees,
Yes.
And I think that's what's happening. The employees having a lot more say now.
Well, you see the railway strike that it has virtually shut down the UK,
Yeah. So that is another issue that we're dealing with coming out of the pandemic. So that in itself would have caused some production issues also.
Tell me, supply issues though. I would have thought that now that the effects of COVID have been receding. I mean, we're living with it and we kind of gone back to normal. But I'm being told that the supply chain has not recovered. Do we still have ships piled up in ports can't offload cargoes?
I'm not sure about ships being piled up. What I've been hearing about is persons not being able to get enough ships. That's what I've been hearing about now. I knew we used to have the pile-up situation, but I hear more is just not being able to get goods on ships.
So what happened to those ships? Where they gone?
Well, I mean, I don't know. Some of them, the businesses would have gone down, right? I think there's also shortages in terms of staffing also affecting some of them, but also some of the channels might have been disrupted because of the war.
Yeah.
So I think the combination of all of those things would have affected it. So I am dealing with a supplier, for example, and things that would normally take about a month or so to come from China are taking months.
I hope I'm not being an alarmist, but some of the conditions that I see, either existing or emerging, would suggest to me that this recession is probably going to be worse than the one we had in 2007.
Oh yeah, definitely. This one is it is at the root. The 2007, 2009 one was because of some turmoil in the financial market. This one is at the heart of production. And there's no prediction about when it's going to end because we don't know if the war is going to get better or worse. We're coming out of a pandemic. So it is an issue. Yeah.
Oh Lord. And are you expecting the Fed to jack up interest rates some more?
Yeah, man. I expect it to go up more.
Not looking good. But as Damien says, when a hurricane comes in, you can't divert it. You just have to do whatever you can to protect yourself.
Yes.
And that seems to be where we're at.
Mm-hmm.
Dennis Chung, thanks a lot for coming on.
Yeah, man. No problem, Mr. Golding. All right. Okay.
Dennis Chung, Economist. We're talking about the current global hurricane. The sheet I have in front of me says current global economic developments, but economic developments is too charitable a word. This is a hurricane. We're going to turn now to a financial analyst to help us to understand some more what this means for Jamaica. Mr. Keith Collister, welcome to the program. Do we have him on? Not yet. Trying to get hold of Keith Collister. He's a financial analyst, columnist as well, who comments frequently on economic matters, macroeconomic issues, and so on, and really want to get his perspective on what is happening. But the situation don't look pretty at all. And there's still so much uncertainty, because you don't know how long it's likely to last, and you don't know how severe it is going to be. I just expressed the view that it's going to be worse than it was in 2007. Keith Collister, welcome to the program.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Not too bad, sir. Not too bad.
Am I being an alarmist when I say that we're in deep doo-doo in terms of what is happening globally and the effect it is likely to have on us?
I don't think you're being an alarmist. Clearly, the U.S. economy, which is the most important thing by far for the Jamaican economy, is approaching a very important point. To me, the issue is whether they can avoid a recession.
What are your thoughts?
Well, I think the problem they have is that they're kind of between a rock and a hard place. So basically, if they're serious about trying to get back to this 2% inflation target, that suggests they may have to achieve that through a recession, as in keep keep raising interest rates to achieve that. If they decide not to do that and accept a higher inflation rate, say perhaps a 4%, then that, they run the longer term risks of damaging the economy over time. Now, there is supposedly a sort of small chance in the middle that things normalize and they can avoid this decision, but I think it's probably not the highest probability. Is it 20%? Is it 30%? Is it less? So that to me looks the lowest probability, at least for the next year or so.
But look at all of the external factors.
Yes.
The war in Ukraine,
that's a huge one. Yes.
That's not going to end anytime soon.
No, that looks like that's a long haul factor, which is why I would say you could argue that it's probably below 20%. As you know, between Russia and Ukraine, there's a significant portion of the world's food, in particular wheat and other items.
Yeah.
Also, of course, Russia is, or used to be, or still is, probably one of the world's largest, if not the world's largest, oil exporter.
Yes.
So basically, what that suggests is that oil prices are unlikely to fall, and the risk is actually possibly to the upside. $188 oil, for example, if there was some kind of further crisis or tightening, or 150 would certainly probably kill all possibility of this sort of narrow window to avoid a U.S. recession, I think.
After that, of course, is this strange. I call it strange. I mean, because I've never seen it at this intensity. The strange kind of weather patterns we've been witnessing, massive floods, drought. There's some river, I can't remember which state it is, but it's a major river that supplies vast areas with water. That river has fallen 12 feet. There is drought in parts of Africa, Asia, Europe, in major food growing areas. That don't look good.
No, it doesn't. You have a sort of I don't know who is left. Clearly there are some people left who don't believe in climate change, but I think all the evidence is around one. And it's very worrying that the Ukraine war in particular continues, just as all these other potential food shocks are occurring. So basically, that food and energy component is, which is the core inflation component, does not look like it's going to normalize, and as I said, could even go up. That shock continues, so it is very worrying.
Now, I well remember the extent and the effects of the U.S. recession in 2007, 2009. I was in office at the time.
Yes.
Now, if, as Dennis Chung feels, and I share that view, that we're looking at a recession that is going to be deeper and perhaps longer this time around, what will that mean for Jamaica? And particularly, what will that mean for the gains that we have made over the last 7-8 years? Is that simply going to roll us back like a snake and ladder or something?
Well, I mean, we have some level of, it is a slightly different situation, at least particularly for Jamaica, in the sense that, for example, we have been operating a balanced budget. We've institutionalized the independent central bank. As probably the most positive thing I would say is that the tourism recovery continues. But the concern I would have, for example, on that is that, sometime a few months out, post-summer, then we'll have an idea of what happens, say, for next winter. So,
but you don't need to guess, Keith. If people in Minnesota and Colorado find that they have to be paying $6 at the gas pump, they have to be paying an extra $40 at the supermarket when they go for their groceries, their mortgage rates have gone up, they're going to have to put off that holiday they had planned to take to Montego Bay. Many of them.
Yeah, well, I would agree with you to a degree, but what I'm saying is I'm not quite sure yet. As I said, we were until very recently we were like at around 70% of now. We might get to what I would call the 2019 summer this time round, right? Because what you saw in the U.S. is you saw this huge increase in the amount of goods that they purchased. So it went up something like 5%. And you saw a massive decline or a significant decline in the amount of services. So when I'm saying 5%, what I mean is 5% of GDP. So if the U.S. was at, say, let's call it 70-30, 70% service economy, 30% goods. You had a sort of 5% increase in the amount of goods purchased, and you had a 5% decline in the amount of services, as a percentage of the overall pie. Uh-huh. Now you're going to see some normalization of that, and that is actually occurring. The question is how much of that normalization is offset by the negative tailwinds that are occurring right now, and it could be a significant chunk. So that's the only reason why I'm saying that I don't think the situation is exactly parallel, but it does mean that it amounts to the same thing. If we were going to have a full tourism recovery and we were back to 2019 by the end of winter, you may not get that because of a U.S. recession possibility by around that time.
What I think would be worrying, and I'd love to have your comment on it. What would be worrying is if the conditions prevailing in our major source market, which is the U.S., if the conditions prevailing there have a negative effect on people's travel inclinations, one. Two, if the Bank of Jamaica finds it necessary to keep moving up interest rates so that businesses find it not particularly appropriate at this time to expand or invest, or some of them may in fact find it difficult to even stay in business. If we get to the stage now where it starts to affect economic activity to the point where businesses start to lay off, some of them go out of business altogether, unemployment goes up, that is grief, no?
I think it's a real risk. I mean, these are the kind of conversations that are being held in organizations such as the PSOJ and JCC in Jamaica with respect to the issue of whether the Bank of Jamaica will overshoot on raising interest rates to deal with the current inflation problem.
Densil Williams seems to feel that it has. Damien King disagrees. Let me just take a break and come right back to you. Take a break right now. Welcome back. It's Jamaica Live. We're on Bridge 99. We're in the last lap now. We've been talking today about the current global situation, how it is affecting us, how it is likely to affect us. What really are we in for? What should we prepare ourselves for? And very importantly, what are the options open to us, and particularly the policy options open to the government and to the regulatory authorities like the Bank of Jamaica? We've been talking with Mr. Keith Collister. Keith, I want to put to you two completely different perspectives as to how we should respond. When I was talking to Professor Densil Williams, he was of the view that we have built up formidable assets in terms of our fiscal management, in terms of our primary surplus, in terms of our debt reduction, in terms of our credibility. And he says that we must be prepared. And he said, this is capital. That's what it is. And in times like these, to avoid the worst possible effects of what we are now facing, we should be prepared to put some of that capital at risk to minimize the damage that it can do to us. And he suggested incentivizing critical sectors that can keep economic activity going. He mentioned, for example, tourism, construction, agriculture. When I spoke with Dr. Damien King, he was of a completely different view. He said that, look, I mean, we have accumulated those assets at such great sacrifice and with such great effort that the worst thing we could ever do now is to damage them, is to cause people to wonder whether or not this resolve that we have demonstrated over the last 7-8 years, whether that resolve is serious. What's your take on it?
Well, I think I have a sympathy for both views, frankly. But I do think that we have to be very, very careful to lean maybe slightly towards Dr. King's view at this time. We have to be very careful in what we do right at this moment because of we are in a better situation to manage this crisis than we have been in the past, right? For exactly those reasons. But if you look, for example, at Eurobond prices, you will see that they've actually fallen quite sharply over the last few months. Now, that's not just us alone. That's what's happening. A global repricing is going on. But what it means is that we can't assume that this credibility that we have can manage all waters, is to use a sort of example of you being on a stormy sea. On the other hand, I would certainly think that we don't, certain areas, particularly areas, I would think something like agriculture. I do think we need to think about what if we need to make some further investments and in food production and really think about how we transform that. I think it's been a very difficult problem here, but we know that we are a large importer of food, and I think we should really think about what can we do to encourage local food production. If it's going to cost us some money, I think we should probably prioritize in that area. Although, as you know, agriculture has been a very difficult proposition in Jamaica. But it does seem to me that your previous point about global weather changes and patterns and so on, we should start to anticipate that and really try and get some food resiliency going. Now, to go back to the interest rate point.
Before you move there, Dennis Chung's view was different. He said that what we really ought to do is to increase taxes on imported food to provide greater incentive for the local farmers. But do they have the capacity to respond?
Well, I'm not sure they do, but I think there probably are. There's areas such as there's the issue of fertilizer and so on, which has been directly impacted by the Russia crisis. So whether there is targeted reliefs that can assist the farmers, I know
in terms of subsidies.
Yeah, in other words, are there he's been willing to do short-term subsidies for electricity costs and so on. Whether there are, I do, whilst I agree with him, you have to be very careful with subsidies and not have unlimited subsidies and not convey the view that these things last forever, which is a point that he has made. I do think there might be some role for some kind of targeted reliefs, and maybe there are other areas to do with the environment or infrastructure, sort of climate resilient infrastructure that we should target. So I think we know we don't have unlimited funds. We know that we have the macro stability that we currently have, or relative macro stability, is an important asset that we don't want to stress too. We don't want to sort of experiment with that going off course, because that has been. We can see other countries, and are already seeing other countries in the globe that are suffering by virtue of that, by not being in as good a macro situation as Jamaica was.
Let me ask you a question, Keith. Take the U.S. situation and the response of the Fed.
Yes.
Do you think that the Fed waited too long?
It does look as though they did. I think the U.S. situation, Jamaica situation, is somewhat different. Although but that's so the U.S. had an enormous stimulus, and
COVID.
Arguably, yes. Well, they did that during COVID, and that was okay. But there's an argument with economists such as Larry Summers that the last one they did was too much, too late, kind of thing. And it seems as though that certainly looks like there's some evidence of that. Now, of course, you could say that, well, the rest of the world is also having an inflation shock, and not all of them spent a lot of money. And I would certainly be of the view that most of the shock is food and energy driven, right, and various other things. But Jamaica's situation was different. We never had an excess demand situation here in Jamaica during COVID and so on, from large monetary policy or fiscal policy impulses like the amount of spending they had in the US or the UK or various other countries. So anyway, we moved earlier than the US, and you could say, and probably the Bank of Jamaica can pat itself on the back to say, well, the US was late, we weren't, right? That's probably what they would argue.
Is there anything else that the BOJ could have done?
Well, they only have one instrument, really. And the concern I had at the time, and I still have that concern, was that there was kind of like a partnership with the banking sector, right? It may have been a private sector partnership, but it was still a partnership. In other words, the bank said, well, during COVID, we will provide support, and the central bank gave them a lot of liquidity. And basically, if you look at the numbers, you would say, well, we managed much better in terms of bad loans and things of that nature than anybody probably had a right to expect here in Jamaica. I believe part of that was by virtue of commercial bank forbearance. Anyway, they stopped that effectively at the beginning of the year. The central bank at the beginning of the year tightened liquidity very sharply, and has been continuing to raise interest rates from last year. So the question is, at what point does this become, a policy that, combined with what looks like a weakening U.S. economy, perhaps towards the end, or you might even see a sort of flat result for the first 6 months in the U.S. right now. You could argue like that is slightly artificial, because that reflects a very high base effects from last year, the first half of last year. But that's not encouraging if you're starting to worry about the U.S. going into recession towards the end of the year, right? So what I'm saying is, our central bank too now needs to think very carefully about how much more it wants to raise interest rates, even though the inflation number is still obviously way above its target range.
Well, we are at 11% now, year on year.
Yes.
Let us say that when the next figures come out, and happily, I noticed that the index itself declined, I think, in
slightly, yes.
April, and in May, I think it was just slightly above.
Yeah.
But let us say, based on all the new things that are happening, the drought and the continued war in Ukraine, Russia seemed to have effectively cut off some of the routes that Ukraine would normally have used to export its grain and so on. Let us say the situation gets worse, so that come June, July, August, we're looking at 12%, 13%, 15%. The Bank of Jamaica is going to have to jump in again, wouldn't it?
Well, I expect that the Bank of Jamaica will continue to raise interest rates. I mean, they have a meeting, I think, coming up at the end of this month. And they would say, well, if you take into account inflation, our monetary policy is still not that tight, right? That's what they would say.
Mm.
And they would also say, if we're going to manage the exchange rate so that it doesn't become a further problem. And, if you look at the exchange rate, you'll see that actually it's been fairly, it's been fairly stable over the last few months.
But before we're almost running out of time, you're a private sector man. And I'm not asking you to speak for the private sector here, but why is it that so many people in the private sector, particularly private sector leaders, don't agree with this at all? Is it that they cannot afford to applaud hiking interest rates? Is it that quietly they understand what is happening, but they can't come out and say, hey, good job, Bank of Jamaica?
Well, I think the part of the concern of the private sector is that, there's always an unintended consequence of something, right? And perhaps one of the unintended consequences of the policy that's occurring at the moment is that one of the things that Jamaica had managed to create at the end of 2019 was an active capital market here, both stock market and corporate bond market. And what these interest rate rises are doing is that and because there's no way to sort of say when is it going to end yet, because there's a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah.
That's creating a situation where you can't assume that Jamaica's big advantage of an active capital market will continue, in the same way indefinitely. In other words,
Keith, I'm out of time. I'm in trouble. Almost 1:00.
But, I think that's one of the issues, that they are concerned about that shock absorber not being there if interest rate rises continue too much.
Yeah, point taken. I want to thank you very much for coming on, Mr. Keith Collister, financial analyst, public commentator. Thank you so much, Keith.
All right, sir. Take care.
That's the end of the program for today. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank Beauregard and the New York crew. Thank my studio engineer, my producer. Thank to all of you who joined in for the program today. Hope you found it useful. Hope you found it informative. God willing, I'll be back here next week, Monday, with another topic for another Jamaica Live on Bridge 99.